So Lester Crown had a really interesting article in Foreign Policy, and I want to discuss that article with y'all, kind of interjecting some of my points as well, talking about how Russia has failed to use its economic might, quote unquote might, to damage countries that support Ukraine. And this is specifically in the area of energy, metals, and food. So to start off, we'll look at natural gas. So in 2021, 83% of Russian natural gas went to Europe via pipelines. The total global exports of the Russian natural gas was 200 billion cubic meters per year. Along with the 7 million barrels of oil, that accounted for about half of Russia's federal revenue. So Russia doesn't really produce anything of value other than the fact that they create oil and natural gas, metals, and food. So those are the areas that they make their money. And all of those were supposed to be leveraged against Western nations to hurt them, and it failed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. So Europe was reliant on Russia for about 46% of its total gas supplies. And that is comparable in other areas such as metals and potash, which was used for fertilizer. But thanks to unseasonably warm weather in Europe, the Europeans aren't freezing to death, as Putin said they would. Europe also very quickly secured alternatives to Russian gas by leveraging the global liquefied natural gas supply chain, which the U.S. is the leader in that regard. The United States supplies now 55 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to Europe, which is 2.5 times more than before when Russia invaded. The Europeans also increased their supplies in other renewable sources, kept nuclear running, and in the interim, unfortunately, had to fire up coal. But I think that was only temporarily, unless they're dumb enough to just double down on never turning nuclear on, or they find ways to pull in liquefied natural gas, which is much cleaner than coal. Now, these alternative supplies have reduced Europe's dependence on Russian gas to only 9% of its total gas imports. In addition, the weather that I talked about means that Europe didn't have to dip into its storage tanks. Germany plussed up its natural gas storage tanks to a record 91% full. It was only 54% last year, meaning that Europe won't have to buy as much over the next year to get through next winter. So because of this, Europe likely has enough gas to last into 2024, providing enough time to get cheaper alternative energy supplies online, as well as build out the infrastructure for receiving more liquid natural gas imports, which by 2024 are expected to be around 200 billion cubic meters per year. That wipes out what Russia used to give or used to sell to Europe. That means Europe will never have to buy Russian natural gas ever again. That hurts Russia tremendously. Now, to make matters worse, everyone will say, what about China? What about India? Well, China's pivoting away from relying on global liquefied natural gas supply chains in favor of building their own domestic supplies, mainly because they have concerns of influence of the United States in the Middle East, as well as the United States and Canada itself being large producers of the product. So they feel they need to build out their own internally, and they do have supplies in China. When they build out their own supplies, they don't need Russia's supplies. So because of all of this, gas futures markets are actually cheaper now than before the war. And this is going to maintain this level for the foreseeable future. I mean, and even those areas where Putin is getting away or finding ways to sell natural gas, it's at steep discounts. And the transportation costs are enormous relative to what used to be piped into Europe. They now have to put on ships. The problem is there's not really a pipeline infrastructure outside of Europe. So therefore, the 150 billion cubic meters of sales of piped gas that used to go to Europe have been replaced by only 150 billion cubic meters have been replaced by 16 billion cubic meters to China. That's enormous drops. That's an enormous drop in the output of liquefied natural gas and natural gas in general for Russia, because there's no market to replace that shortfall. As I said, China lacks the necessary pipeline capacity to take any more than that 16 billion cubic meters, and that's going to last for a decade. And Russia doesn't have the technology to scale liquefied natural gas rapidly, nor are the sanctions going to allow them to build out such facilities for a long time. It's going to be a slow trickle. Now, as we move on to oil, his oil efforts are also diminishing. When Putin took oil supplies off the market, it did cause prices to go up 40% over about a 2-week period. It slowly recovered over time. It took months to recover, but we are actually now in a place where we have recovered fully from that level. In fact, when the G7 rolled out price caps announcing that we would cap the price of oil globally during this war, Putin decided he was going to retaliate by announcing a ban on oil exports to countries that accepted the price caps. This caused oil prices to actually go down, despite the fact that Russian oil would come off the market. This is because the loss of Russian oil was factored in, and countries buying Russian oil are doing so at such a discount due to Russian desperation. It's driving prices down everywhere. China and India aren't really participating in the oil cap, but really kind of are, because they're leveraging essentially blackmail tactics to drive hard bargains against Russia, where they're getting discounts of up to 50%. So even though India is buying 33 more times more oil than it was a year ago, Russia's not making as much profit because it costs $44 to produce. They're selling it for half of what it is on the market, so they're only making about $5 to $6 per barrel due to costly transport. So if Putin decides he wants to cut production even more, basically countries are just going to be like, screw it, we'll just find other areas, the US, Canada, the Middle East, and that's going to cause problems for Russia. Now, oil prices are cheaper now, largely because of ramping up by the United States, Venezuela, Canada, and Brazil. All of you remember when everyone said Brazil is on Russia's side? Yeah, no, they aren't. In fact, Saudi Arabia has stopped playing ball with Russia because it fears the United States pausing crucial arms and technology transfers. So even OPEC is not on board with Russia anymore when it comes to this. So Putin's leverage in oil and natural gas has evaporated completely. Another way Putin tried to influence was by weaponizing food. Now, this didn't work very well, and it actually didn't work quickly, because many of his allies came in and turned on him and forced him into the Black Sea grain deal, meaning food is getting out, and food is getting out at market prices, not at Russia's wish to hold prices up to reap the revenues off of it. So food has failed. Certain metals, which is another thing people talk about, where Russia used to dominate, things like nickel, palladium, titanium, cobalt, etc., the war in Ukraine has caused investors to see prices go up. Well, when prices go up, people want to invest. When you invest, it expedites the the manufacturing process to build out mines and supply chains. So we've seen supply chains and mines in North and South America, Africa, and Australia come online very quickly to try to tap into those untapped mineral reserves. Several cobalt and nickel mines are starting to come online and should be fully running in the next 2 years, which will replace all of Russia's metals in cobalt and nickel. Now, where Russia does have some leverage is in potash, which is a critical component in fertilizer. Now, I say for now because Canada and Brazil have stepped up the production. Prices peaked out at $1,200 per ton, which impacted food prices, but dropped to $600 per ton at the end of the year last year. Now, agriculture experts at DTN project that a further 25 to 30% drop is coming this year, mainly due to efforts in North and South America. Brazil and Canada are driving that. So whether it is energy, food, or metals, Russia has lost economically, and they will not recover. Their economic collapse will take place in the next 12 to 18 months, period.